So this is 09:55 hours GMT, 9:55 a.m. in the morning of Sunday, 11th of April 2021. Now this is part B of the Khoodeelaar campaign, World Exclusive Diagnosis of Fleet Street. Now, the reason why we call it World Exclusive Diagnosis of Fleet Street is because of the facts. No program, no outlet is doing what we are doing, looking at the actual contents and the role and the narrative and the agenda exhibited and conducted and operated by Fleet Street papers. Fleet Street, of course, is the collective name of the British daily newspapers that are wrongly referred to as the Nationals. But they are actually London-centric main kind of collection of printed papers that used to be, most of them like the Times and the Telegraph, based in the street called Fleet Street, which is near the St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And from the other end, it's near the Strand. And although the newspaper's operations have shifted away from Fleet Street itself, they have long been known as Fleet Street collectively. And that name has stuck. It has remained in use, and Fleet Street is meant to refer to those papers and the others, like the Daily Star and others that, of course, were based in Fleet Street, but they joined later than the Express, the Daily Mail, and the Times and the Telegraph. The Daily Mail had an office in a place off Fleet Street, but it was so close to Fleet Street physically that it was also treated as being in Fleet Street itself. Now, the reason why we didn't do a diagnosis yesterday, Saturday the 10th of April 2021, is to do with the totally irrational obsession, the dedication to the husband of Brenda, also known as the Queen Elizabeth II. And it is unacceptable because so much is going on in the lives of millions of people in Britain, in the UK, including the latest protests that have erupted in Northern Ireland. And in the rest of the world, so many hundreds of millions of people are affected by dire problems and tragedies and losses. So when we say the gullibles, we mean the majority of the people in Britain of indigenous. Indigenous itself is a controversial and inconclusive kind of and misleading word, because indigenous depends on the context of the time. For example, indigenous in what time, in what period? People that are now known as the indigenous white people have had their origins in migration into Britain or the island of the British Isles, let's say. So it depends on what period historically is being referred to by the word indigenous. But for our purposes, indigenous sufficiently kind of represents the people of the last, let's say, 500 years. And the indigenous are the ones that are white and can be called as settled, original, let's say, people of this island. Original again, qualified by the description that I have stated earlier in this segment. What we are looking at today in the Sunday Times is, of course, the rampant, blatant criminality and corruption, unconstitutionality in such a brazen way that if it were taking place in a country, say in the continent of Asia or Africa, would be readily described as banana republic. For instance, the latest resignation in the South Indian state of Maharashtra by a minister around the allegation that he was involved in bribery or extortion around the sum of 200 million or 100 crores in Indian rupee terms. That is the kind of banana republic behavior. The minister demanding money, bribe, and so on. What Cameron has done is not called bribe, but it is actually worse than a bribe because he took over the government. Cameron effectively was telling Johnson that Johnson should make the finance minister, Rishi Sunak, behave as Johnson knew Cameron had wanted. And it wasn't just Cameron. Cameron's employer, the disgraced criminal, Australian criminal Lex Greensill, who had himself been allowed to control Cameron's administration. And as this was going on, nobody was publishing anything in Fleet Street about what was going on. And that is the norm. Fleet Street is complicit in the criminal conduct and behavior of the likes of Cameron and his predecessors as well. But the criminality of the regime fronted by John Major would pale into insignificance when compared with the criminality, the brazen criminality and thuggery exhibited in the behavior of Cameron. After Cameron left the actual post of being Prime Minister. Now that shows not only institutional criminality and corruption at the center of the UK government, but it also shows that those who are so brazenly corrupt as Cameron has been shown as having been, have total confidence in the fact that they will not be even mildly kind of told off, let alone being prosecuted. Now we shall talk about the various implications of the Mueller investigations, Robert Mueller investigations in the USA, but not yet. Because although both the systems, so-called, the governments, are called democracies, the extent of democratic audit that sometimes appears to be quite rigorous in the USA is not comparable to the lax environment that has been created by serial criminals under the guises of democratic government. And the serial criminals most certainly include Cameron. As we said earlier in the week about the evidence that Cameron was kind of obliged to give to Brian Levison's inquiry that Cameron himself ironically set up. That series of disclosures that Cameron himself was forced to make to the publicly held inquiry, and the various comments made by Rebecca Brooks, who is the UK head of the media operations of Rupert Murdoch. Although intellectually she is very vacant and empty, for a strange reason, which we have alluded to before, Rebecca Brooks has been overly kind of rewarded and protected and platformed by Murdoch. The details of Murdoch's criminality in relation to creating this power around Rebecca Brooks are not yet publicly accessible, but they will be publicly accessible in time in the future. But pending that, there was enough in her admissions to the Levison proceedings that showed that Cameron was a sleazeball of the most contemptible description. So we go back to the references to Jeremy Corbyn's intellectual unfitness. The Levison disclosures came years before anyone ever suspected that Corbyn would even put himself forward as a leader of the Labour Party, let alone get elected to that post. So Corbyn had enough evidence publicly available for him, if he had the intellectual ability, to go to town, as they say, to rip apart the criminal history and the anti-democratic history of David Sleazeball Cameron. But he didn't. The fact that Corbyn didn't wasn't because there was no evidence or because there was no morality in his going for Cameron politically, but because Corbyn was clueless. Corbyn didn't even know these things. What I'm saying, and what I'm saying is not available or made available or obtained by some secret channel. It's all publicly available. The facts, that is, not what I am saying in terms of the commentary. So Corbyn, why couldn't Corbyn access those facts? Undeniable, indisputable facts. Facts that showed that Cameron was very close, too embarrassingly close to Rebecca Brooks. How can I put it any more delicately? I mean, the the amount of contracts and the phone calls or the texts that transpired between Rebecca Brooks and Cameron. Too much. And that Cameron is an immoral person, shameless beyond condemnation. Came across during the so-called funeral or events relating to the funeral of Nelson Mandela, when Cameron and the stupid Barack Obama openly engaged in flirting with the wife of Neil Kinnock's Neil Kinnock's son, the Dutch wife of the son of Neil Kinnock's. It's all available online. It's absolutely embarrassingly stupid flirting. So these are not people of any real moral kind of decorum or self-respect. So Cameron should have been sunk immediately by Corbyn. But Cameron was allowed to carry on. Not only that, Cameron was allowed to wrongly and unjustifiably capitalize on his disgraceful behavior as leader of the government. And there was nothing Cameron said or did or hinted at or suggested that had any relationship with what Cameron was doing at the time. Every day of the government was a disgraceful day against the people of the country, against democracy, against accountability, against lawfulness and legality and rigorous compliance with the various obligations, both in terms of domestic duties as well as under the various conventions and agreements and declarations, treaties that the UK was a member of and signatory to. So when we say that the newspapers have been complicit in allowing Cameron's corruption, we don't say that as a figure of speech. That is the fact. That is actually what happened. And today's Sunday Times disclosures about Cameron's abuse of contracts with Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, and others on behalf of Cameron's employer, the crook Lex Grensil, only illustrates and represents and serves as a tip of the iceberg of the real extent and magnitude and the depth of criminality that Cameron was part of and facilitating during his entire period as Prime Minister and also as the leader of the Conservatives. So this is a comment also against Keir Starmer, because all this evidence Keir Starmer is completely silent about. Think about this. This evidence contains hundreds of elements and kind of parts, any number of parts. Any number of these parts can be credibly, factually cited as lethal indictments of the corrupt David Cameron and of the Conservative government and of the so-called judicial system. I mean, there is no evidence that anyone even thought to mention that if not on everything, but on too many of his wrongdoings and criminality, Cameron should have been prosecuted. And even now they are not talking about him deserving to be prosecuted thoroughly. Because given by the definition of wrongdoing and breaking of the law, Cameron has broken literally hundreds of codes and hundreds of rules. So if not on all those, he should be safely, that is to say, the prosecution of Cameron can be done safely in the confident knowledge that there is enough, more than enough evidence and grounds to convict him. But the question of conviction doesn't arise because he has not been even mentioned as a criminal. We are saying this, but the evidence on which we are basing the saying that Cameron has been a crook is also available to other people, because they are published. And in today's Sunday Times publication, the act of publishing and publication is not hypothetical. It's not a smear. It's not a suggestion. It's not a conspiracy. It is a fact. The Sunday Times itself has found justifiable and necessary to publish. So it's not like in a backdoor conspiracy theory platform that somebody's muttering something. It is actual texts, actual contents, and actual contracts that Cameron made, Lex Greensill made, with the government that is now fronted by Johnson, and also in the past, in the period between Cameron leaving government and other people taking over, like Theresa May. Now, Cameron is, this is the one that we're talking about, the lengthy kind of full page. This account by Caroline Wheeler and Gabriel Pogrand it doesn't contain every detail, of course. It doesn't contain all the facts, but it contains enough detail and enough facts to convict Cameron. Cameron is not a kind of exceptional conservative. That is to say, he's not the only one doing this, but he is the one that has been found in the current kind of last, let's say, 10 years to have been doing it the worst. So that is the kind of disclaimer that there are others as well. Now here is the kind of white against red background, Sheridan is being quoted as saying, and when he says talk, that means he's referring to the phone conversation or conversations. Great to talk. Here are the bullet points I promised. And he says in the bullet points, what we most need is for Rishi to have a good look at this and ask officials to find a way of making it work. That is what Sheridan is saying, is what Cameron said to him, not him saying to somebody. So it's Cameron saying, great to talk. Here are the bullet points I promise. That is Cameron saying this to the staff member Sheridan Westlake. And he's saying, Cameron is saying, what we most need is for Rishi Sunak to have a good look at this and ask officials to find a way of making it work. It seems nuts to exclude supply chain finance. We all know that the banks will struggle to get these loans out of the door. And so other methods of extending credit to firms become even more important. All good wishes, DC, that is David Cameron. Now he is saying, remember banking is the kind of ongoing corruption industry in capitalism. Banks are the platforms for criminality on a daily basis. Banks are the ones that facilitate big business, high volume, high octane credit. That is, they make available billions of pounds to criminals, organized as governments, organized as government-linked agencies and operators, hedge funders and so forth. So Cameron is admitting that even the banks will not make the finance available. Notice what he's saying. He's saying banks will struggle. So if the banks are not prepared to give the money to Greensill, I mean, what does it make Cameron doing to the government? He's turning the government into the lowest of the low level of guardian of public finance and whatever. He's opening the door of the finance ministry to make the biggest and the least audited and accountable operation available at public expense, costing hundreds of millions of pounds or even several billion pounds if it went ahead and reached the ambitious plot that Cameron and Greensill and others were embarked on. So Cameron is saying to the finance minister and to Boris Johnson that let's rob the country. So if Brink's-Mat bank robbery, which is the latest big one, comes across as a very articulated, very extensively complicated operation, daring, then compared to what Boris Johnson was being asked to get involved in doing, asked by Cameron to get involved in doing, because Rishi Sunak is nobody. Rishi Sunak is in post, but Rishi Sunak is not himself. He is only an instrument for Boris Johnson. So what Cameron was telling Boris Johnson to do was to carry out hundreds of brink's-mat bank robbery worth the value of the money. So it's a looter's government. It's a robber's government. And how powerful is this evidence usable against these crooks? And there is no sign of any. There is no sign even Starmer has even heard of this. Now, if that is the reality, that is the truth of corruption and criminality and looting and robbery of the entire government, then anything, any agency, any institution, any local council, like Tower Hamlets, cannot be expected to do anything other than follow this culture or criminality, which is exactly what has been happening in Tower Hamlets. And there is no fear. The criminals don't have any fear that they will be exposed by the local papers, because the local papers are even worse than the criminals themselves. As I said about the editor, the so-called editor of the Archant-owned East London Idiotizer and the New Home Recorder. This person, this woman who has been described as having been involved with the New Home Recorder and the related titles since the 1980s. Think about this is somebody who has been involved nearly 40 years, and she is totally, absolutely devoid of any common sense, let alone any journalistic interest or impulse to report on the criminality that goes on in the local councils, in the area of the so-called titles that she is supposedly editor of. So all levels of criminality and crimes are being hushed up and covered up. And compared to these 4 girls, the Bethnal Green school girls, who have been betrayed and neglected on purpose by the Tower Hamlets Council, and these girls have not been even alleged to have committed a crime, let alone put on trial for any crime. Compare those girls as symbolized in this current narrative, topical narrative by Shamima Begum. Those girls, at no stage of their kind of publicly reported presence in foreign countries and foreign territories, at no stage has any of these girls been extended any support or even solidarity or sympathy or understanding at any level by the local Tower Hamlets Council, which is supposed to be under legal duty or duties of care, safeguarding these children. They have not been given any support, any safeguarding by the local council, which has been under legal duty to safeguard them. And the link to mysterious forces abolishing crimes, it has to be in this context. Remember that all the wrongs and all the corruption that Richard Morey, the election commissioner, identified as being the reason for his ruling that Lutfur Rahman should be banned from public office for 5 years, and that Lutfur Rahman should be immediately kicked out of his post as elected mayor in the name of Tar Amlers. Now, none of these statements contained in the ruling by Richard Morey, dated the 23rd of April 2015, none of these rulings, none of these claims as he made against Lutfur Rahman, none of these has been, if you like, overturned by any appeal court or any appeal kind of hearing, including by any judicial review, which hasn't been held. Although Lutfur Rahman tried to have some judicial review, some of the parts of the ruling by Richard Morey, Lutfur Rahman was not allowed to have a review, judicial review. So all of that means that any assertion that Lutfur Rahman was innocent of the statements of the wrongs that Morey said he was guilty of has not been established. And in the absence of any of that being established by the or within or through the British or English judicial system, it cannot be conclusively said that Lutfur Rahman has been declared innocent of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or all of the allegations and assertions made by Morey in his ruling dated the 23rd of April 2015. He hasn't been. Lutfur Rahman has not been found innocent of the wrongdoings that Morey found him responsible, guilty of in the context of the ruling of an election commissioner. The word guilty can be expressed in different ways, but essentially it is wrongdoing that has been asserted against Lutfur Rahman by the election commission that declared its ruling against Lutfur Rahman. It declared it on the 23rd of April 2015. And in the absence of any of these assertions being overturned, judicially overturned, it is the case that all these allegations and assertions and findings of fact by Richard Morey stand. So it would appear that if they do stand, then one of the things that Morey recommended to the Metropolitan Police was for the police to take appropriate action based on his findings against Lutfur Rahman. And repeated kind of attempts, pseudo attempts, and enforced and reluctant attempts by the London Metropolitan Police and the relevant agent or agencies to take further the recommendation and the evidence against Lutfur Rahman and to start proceedings in the criminal court system against Lutfur Rahman for crimes. So, has there been any such prosecution? Is the question. And the answer is that no. No prosecution as such has happened against Lutfur Rahman. Why not? The question is, why has no criminal action been taken against Lutfur Rahman? And the answer is, nobody knows. Because the police, the Metropolitan Police, have repeatedly issued statements that do not really address the specific contents contained in the Richard Mowry ruling. Instead, the Metropolitan Police have issued several statements saying that they haven't found sufficient evidence to prosecute Lutfur Rahman. Now, insufficient evidence is such a wide and such a kind of unaccountable statement that anyone looking at a statement containing this phrase, insufficient evidence or lack of evidence, cannot be the wiser for reading it or knowing this. Unless the police, the Metropolitan Police and the Crown Prosecution Service and the Director of Public Prosecutions is pressed directly as to the details, as to each of the sequences. And unless an actual express statement, real statement is extracted from the police in relation to each of the questions outstanding, unless such a thing happens, nobody can say that Lutfur Rahman is innocent. Because the insufficient evidence or lack of evidence does not constitute, in this context, given all the details, it could, in other cases where there is no contextual further evidence to suspect wrongdoing. But in the case of Lutfur Rahman, all the publicly known and reported evidence shows that he has been persistent in doing wrongs. Now, not all the wrongs can be treated as being covered by any supposed impunity. There is no impunity from criminality. So, why hasn't the Labour Party made demands that all the known and undeniable wrongs by Lutfur Rahman must be prosecuted? And the answer is that the Labour Party has not got a morally superior record. And when I say that the Labour Party does not have a morally superior record in this context, I mean the Labour Party's record as a party that is in principle, centrally engaged in opposing corruption is almost zero. So all of these suggest that democracy doesn't exist in Tower Hamlets, because the democratically elected component of the council, that is the number of councillors who have got in at elections held in 2010, 2014, 2018. These are the elections that are kind of mentionable in the context of looking at the wrongs done by the elected mayor post Khoodeelaar. The opponents on the council to Khoodeelaar were all in the Labour Party and the 2 or 3 Conservatives at the time. So what the opposition did, the opposition councillors, because the elected mayor post could only be occupied by one person at a time. So it was already occupied by Khoodeelaar, while the opposition was made of mainly councillors that didn't have any executive post, obviously. But there was no law, there is no law as we speak today, Sunday the 11th of April 2021. There is no law and there is no convention that says that the absence of expressly, legislatively kind of understood and expressed connection between the wrongdoer and any limitation, as I said, to the wrongdoer being prosecuted. There has not been any disclosure. Remember what I'm saying, that any particular act of parliament or any precedent as part of the referable decisions in the highest court in context, that any such thing legally precluded the prosecution of Khoodeelaar in a criminal court or in criminal courts. No such item has been offered as the reason or as connected with the reason for not prosecuting Khoodeelaar, which means that the councillors who have been elected in those 4 elections had no excuse to say that any law or any precedent or any convention, that is judicial convention, prevented them from raising the demand that Khoodeelaar be prosecuted, either post facto or contemporaneously, or in view of the universality of kind of freedom by the prosecuting authorities to prosecute anyone who has done a crime or an offense, no matter how far back that crime or offense goes. So why didn't the councillors of any party or parties make use of the option that they could demand for the record on the council that Lutfur Rahman be investigated criminally. What stopped them? And that is why it is important. This is the period when the demand is supposedly being made to convince the voters in Tar Hamlets to vote no to the question of elected mayor system in Tar Hamlets during the vote on the 6th of May 2021. They must vote no. Why? Because no councillor is allowed under a mayor system of whatever political color to behave as independent representatives of the electors while there is a post of elected mayor in action. Because elected mayors control the majority of the councillors that support them, so they are silent. So the elected mayor is not only inherently dictatorial, authoritarian, anti-democratic, but it also nullifies the election of the councillors by making the elected councillors subject to the approval of the elected mayor. They are elected, but then their election is effectively denied by the elected mayor in post. And if the councillors are silenced or they are silent, then the borough is silent and silenced, which is what has been happening. Because all the decisions, the executive decisions on behalf of, in the name of the council, are all the decisions are distorted, let's say, and are twisted and made poisonous by the assertion of dictatorial authority, monopoly authority by the incumbent, that is the post holder at the given time of the post of elected mayor. Now, we have said extensively about the Conservative MP Robert Neil holding a debate about council's monitoring officers. That debate was held in January 2013. So January 2013, the debate was not held in the actual kind of floor of the House of Commons in the Palace of Westminster. It was held in a neighboring building, and it was called Westminster Hall. Or at least it is referred to as Westminster Hall in the online records of the debate that are kind of accessible. And by definition, these kind of debates are not very, attended by a very small number of people, let's say. but their validity and the parliamentary status is the same as any other debate in the formal record of the House of Commons. So what Robert Neal said about the monitoring officer was that monitoring officer in place in Tower Hamlets at the time covered in by the debate was Isabella Freeman. And Isabella Freeman, although in post as the monitoring officer and as the chief legal advisor to the chief executive, which is the chief executive elected mayor, she was condemned by evidence cited by Robert Neal that she said that Lutfur Rahman, while present at the council meetings, should not answer any questions put to him by the councillors, because, as she wrongly claimed, if he answered any questions put to him, that is the mayor, by any councillor or anybody else within the procedure, that is, then he, the incumbent in the post of elected mayor, which was Lutfur Rahman at the time, would allow the violation of his human rights. Now, it is such a completely, absolutely wrong, quote, reason for Isabella Freeman or anyone else to give that it warrants a campaign dedicated against that outrage. It is against all the laws. It is against the concept of democracy accountability. And it is against the very serious, urgent needs of the people in the borough, whose needs are denied by that denial of answers by Lutfur Rahman, whose human rights are violated by Lutfur Rahman's being wrongly shielded by Isabella Freeman. And it is impossible, given all the context of the evidence, published evidence of misconduct and wrongdoing by Lutfur Rahman, both in the post as executive mayor and other relatedly citable kind of contextual items of evidence about his misconduct and wrongdoing, that Lutfur Rahman himself was never going to disagree with that excuse spouted on his behalf by Isabella Freeman, because Lutfur Rahman was benefiting from the illegality that was fronted by Isabella Freeman on his behalf, and for her to keep the job. Because what the Richard Morey ruling actually shows, and I'm saying in the present tense, actually shows, is that Lutfur Rahman has been engaged in criminal activities, but has been shielded by various criminal activity, criminally active elements in decision making, posts in various agencies that operate around the London Borough of Tower Hamlets Council. For example, from Eric Pickles down to Peter Golds, and Dave Hill in The Guardian, and now On London, and others, whoever is shielding the perpetrators from being held to account. All these people are operating openly, and they are not being held to account by any of the councillors making any comment. No claim. None of the councillors has made any comment, let alone any demand for the prosecution of Lutfur Rahman. And that is not only down to, that is caused by Lutfur Rahman himself alone. That is also the reason why John Biggs should be treated as a criminal. Because Biggs has bribed several elected councillors with bogus posts. These are bogus posts because in the description of the posts, it clearly says that the particular post holder will only do certain things, only do make statements and whatever, subject to the approval of the mayor. So it's a complete brazen, exclusive, kind of openly, publicly exhibited two fingers or defiance to the rules. So for all of those reasons, we are saying that to people in Tower Hamlets, voting on the 6th of May 2021 to completely say no, clearly say no to the elected mayor. And we shall be continuing in the next part